Okay, so why won't the ADA insist in its guidelines on a baseline measurement of insulin or a 2-hour glucose tolerance test or a 4-hour craft test? Why? Because the treatment to reverse high insulin is a low-carb diet or a ketogenic diet, not a pill. And therefore, big pharma is not interested, right? There's no money exchange. There's nothing to be made by putting patients on a ketogenic diet.
Dr. Don, how did you find Carnivore?
Well, Dave, as you may know from some of the preliminary notes that I sent you, I practiced medicine for 40 years. But in medical school, I never learned about proper nutrition, really, and malnutrition as the root cause of all modern disease. And so I both followed and advised the standard American diet, which essentially means eating from all food groups, eating the rainbow, eating whole grains, eating in moderation, no fat, carbs up to 65% of daily calories, and fat no more than 5% of daily calories. And I didn't understand or learn about the corruption that spawned the food pyramid guidelines until recently, and which has contaminated medical research, medical training, and so on. So over the years, I became fatter and sicker. And I very much regret the fact that I gave patients, for example, type 2 diabetic patients, medications that made them fatter and sicker, like giving insulin that they may not have needed, and not understanding that they could improve alone without medication, just on proper diet. So, mea culpa. Now, my father was obese, and he was in later life on insulin, and he died of a stroke of 76. And I had a paternal grandfather, my father's father, who was obese and died of pancreatic cancer. So that should have been a tip-off that something was wrong. Now, I was obese. My body mass index was 34. I had dyslipidemia, lipid disorder on medication, hypertension on medication, prediabetes with an A1C of 5.8. I snored and likely had sleep apnea from ectopic fat deposition in my tongue and my neck blocking my airway. I had a coronary calcium CT, which showed a CAC score of 274, which is moderate risk for coronary artery disease. Most of it was in my left anterior descending artery, which is also known as a widowmaker, as you know, which was found out when I insisted on a CT angiogram. But it didn't approach a 50% blockage, which is usually the criteria for a cardiologist recommending bypass surgery, not that I would have had it. I started my, September 2024 will be my 2-year anniversary on Carnivore, which I started at age 72. My initial issues, I got the keto flu with constipation, insomnia, and muscle cramps. That lasted about a week, but it resolved, especially after I took extra magnesium and increased my intake of salt and fats. Now, what health benefits did I observe on the carnivore diet? Well, the first thing I realized was that my health issues were not inevitably associated with aging. That's a lie. And that, in fact, scientists looking at our DNA telomeres can tell us, barring accident or injury, and if we ate properly, we could live to 115 or longer. I had increased mental clarity and focus, increased energy, loss of brain fog, better sleep, improved with daily sun exposure, which, as you know, increases vitamin D production from the cholesterol in the skin. And also, sun exposure increases your capillary nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator to help lower your blood pressure. So I was in better mood, calmer, less irritable, less hangry, hungry and angry. And I had a 62-pound weight loss over the course of about a year and a half. My BMI went from 34 to just over 25 now, which at my age is considered to be pretty perfect. I had no constant hunger. I didn't need in-between meal snacking, but if I did snack, I usually ate cheese wisps, which are pure baked cheddar cheese, and pork rinds fried in lard, not in vegetable oil. I had improved dental examination. I now use fluoride-free toothpaste. I don't floss. I use xylitol mints or gum because the dentist Ellie Phillips, who you may know who's on YouTube, uses xylitol as a means of suppressing um, Streptococcus mutans, which is the main bacterium that causes cavity and decay. So that's the only reason I use it. Otherwise, I wouldn't. I had sleep apnea, which is gone. I had facial swelling and nose swelling, which you could see if you did serial passports, which I've done. It's just amazing, the difference between them. Astounding. I have no more hypertension. My prediabetes resolved. I went from an A1C of 5.8 to 5.4. My triglyceride to HDL ratio, which you know is about 5 times more accurate than LDL in predicting heart disease. So that went down, and I'm no longer in the pre-diabetic range, though I watch it carefully about every 3 months. My triglycerides actually used to be 147 in 2015. That was dangerously high. And now they're 59, considering the ideal is between 60 and 70. So what a resolution there. Eh? And statins lowered my LDL, okay, but they also lowered my HDL, which is exactly what you don't want. And my HDL went down to 39, which is actually quite dangerous. It's now back up to 57. That's why my ratio is 1-to-1. So, of course, my own doctor, being ignorant of these numbers, not knowing that you can get a ratio of triglycerides to HDL just off the basic lipid panel, and that you can calculate a remnant VLDL just off the lipid panel. He didn't know anything about this. And so when I had these dangerous values, he had no comment to me, except that I should swim more laps because of my weight, as if yes, exactly, as if exercise can make up for a bad diet. And of course, I was ignorant about all of this. So I'm not worried now about soft coronary plaque buildup. And I believe there could even be regression over time, as has occurred with others. It's not common, but it can happen. And of course, as my HDL goes up, it's going to help remove some of that cholesterol from the coronary plaque. Now, I have mild osteoporosis of the left femoral neck, possibly as a result of these statins, because some studies have been done relating higher dose statins to osteoporosis. So I'm going to repeat my DEXA scan in September to see whether or not at least I can get back to osteopenia. And eating a high protein meal creates the collagen from which the minerals can be deposited. If you don't have the building blocks there, you're out of luck. You can't do anything. Now, how I eat, I have daily time restricted eating window. A lot of people have 16 and 8. I have 18 and 6. So I eat at usually 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. But 3 days a week, I eat one meal only, which is equivalent to a 24-hour fast. I feel fine with that. I'm not hungry. And I eat till full. There's no calorie counting. Now, what I eat, I'm a strict carnivore. And my brunch usually consists of meat, very often beef, a little bit of chicken thigh. And for dinner, I'll make breakfast. I'll make it in the morning, 4-egg omelet with cheese and bacon or sausage. And when I have my evening meal, it may be with smoked salmon or herring or grilled fish like salmon in order to get my EPA and DHA. And I try to have bone broth once or twice a week. And occasionally I'll have a carnivore pizza made with a chicken crust. I've become a very good cook, Dave. For exercise, I do alternate high impact interval training with weight resistance training. So one day, I don't do it very long, maybe 15 minutes, but I try to lift heavy if I can. And I can't do the sprinting that Sean O'Mara recommends. But I have a stationary bike with pedal gradation so that you can increase the resistance on that. So for a lot of people who are worried about their knees or their back, doing sprints as a HIIT training, they can maybe try the stationary bicycle, which gives me a pretty good workout. Um, so now, as far as supplements, I take magnesium, 500 milligrams, aspirin, 81 milligrams, as for secondary prevention because I know I have coronary disease. Vitamin D, 10,000 units daily, which if I told my doctor, he'd probably go ballistic. Why are you taking so much? But I track my vitamin D levels. So what you want is a vitamin D level over 50, and as close to 100 as you can get. Now, the Maasai, interestingly enough, even though they have dark skin, they check their vitamin D levels. It's between 100 and 150. That tells you something. Okay. So anyway, you know that I have a beef against modern medicine practices.
What are some of the failures of modern medicine that fail to treat chronic disease?
Oh, terrible. Criminal, I would call it. It's more than medical malpractice. It's actually criminal because of the conspiracies and so on, and the exchange of money. So modern medicine fails to diagnose early on metabolic syndrome, also called insulin resistance syndrome, and its downstream associated diseases, which are, of course, as you know, high insulin, the root cause of all problems that we're having. It's malnutrition through improper human diet, processed foods, high in sugar, high in toxic seed oils. The modern Western chronic medical illnesses are associated with high baseline insulin and high after meal insulin or postprandial insulin, which in turn are associated with dangerous spikes in glucose from eating too much plant carb foods and seed oils. And so the liver turns this excess digested sugar, which is derived from plants, as you know, which is first deposited internally within the liver. And the liver can take about a half a pound of fat storage. And after that, the liver becomes inflamed. And that leads to fibrosis or scarring. It leads to cirrhosis of the liver. It leads to liver failure and transplantation and liver cancer. So our obesity epidemic, it's not the obesity that causes fatty liver. It's high insulin causes both obesity and fatty liver. And that causes liver failure and cancer. I knew nothing about this. Anyway, once the liver is filled up, the excess fat is sent out to the periphery. It goes into the abdomen as visceral fat. It goes into the muscles, including the heart muscle. It goes into the pancreas and poisons the beta cells in the pancreas, the very cells that are making the insulin. It poisons them. But this is reversible. That's the point. And it goes into the walls, of course, of the arterial blood vessels via lipoproteins to be deposited within, developing plaque. So here's the interesting point. A person's fasting blood glucose can be normal for years, but if you measure the insulin, it can predate a formal diagnosis of diabetes by 2 decades. So you can have this by 2 decades. You can have normal blood sugar, but progressively higher insulin until the pancreas gives out. And that's when you get your diabetes. So modern medicine does not advocate for measuring insulin or its precursor, which we call C-peptide levels early on, or which could predict the onset of diabetes even before the fasting blood sugar rises. Number 2, it does not advocate for tracking postprandial or after meal sugar by giving patients at risk a home glucose monitor. Now, you know, when my A1C was up, I asked my doctor, look, I'd like to keep track of my daily sugars after meals. At least I need to know what I'm eating. I think I'm eating pretty healthy, but I'd like reassurance. Can you prescribe me a home glucose monitor, please? He says, of course I can prescribe it for you, but the HMO won't pay for it. It'll only pay for it when you're full-blown diabetic, when your A1C is 6.5 or greater. That's when it will pay for it. Okay, criminal. And also, modern medicine doesn't advocate for the routine use of a glucose challenge test. Now, as you probably know, if my A1C, say, was 5.7, well, by standard definition, I'm not diabetic because you have to be 6.5 or greater. But if you gave me a glucose challenge, At any time, either 1 or 2 hours after giving me the glucose, if my blood sugar went over 200, that's diabetes, even though my A1C is normal. And that's why Ford Brewer, who you may know from PrevMed, Preventive Medicine, his website, he says, look, the best single test to prove whether or not you have diabetes, even if your A1C is either normal or just above normal, is to get, there are two types of glucose challenges. One is the 2-hour postprandial blood sugar test, where they do the fasting sugar, and then they measure they do a fasting insulin, and they measure your sugar at 1 hour and 2 hours. So if your sugar is between 140 and 200, that's glucose intolerance. Okay. If it's over 200, that's diabetes. All right. But he says that's the best test now to get, if your HMO or your doctor can order it, and if you can't order it, get it from Quest or from LabCorp, or one of those outside agencies, is a Kraft test. And a Kraft test is a little bit more detailed than the 2-hour glucose tolerance test, because it's a 4-hour glucose tolerance test. And they measure your sugar, your insulin fasting, again, a half hour, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, and sometimes 4 hours if you're going to have a 4-hour test. And they've developed some curves, and you can see how abnormal your curves are. And that's a great tool to have. I haven't had a Kraft test at this point, simply because I know my insulin levels are normal and my A1C went back to normal. So I'm good that way. But there are many people out there whose doctors have said, wow, your A1C is 5.7, whatever. And so you're going to ask them, can I have this Kraft test done? First of all, they'll be surprised that you know what it is. And a lot of them won't know what it is. And you can explain it to them. And if they refuse or say it's not in our protocol, we it's a money issue, the HMO won't pay for it, then go outside and spend it and get it done. Okay, so why won't the ADA insist in its guidelines on a baseline measurement of insulin, or a 2-hour glucose tolerance test, or a 4-hour Kraft test? Why? Because the treatment to reverse high insulin is a low-carb diet or a ketogenic diet, not a pill. And therefore, big pharma is not interested, right? There's no money exchange. There's nothing to be made by putting patients on a ketogenic diet. All right, you say, but what's the connection? Well, the ADA gets significant funding from big food, and which makes us sick, and big pharma, which keeps us sick and dependent and frightened. And it's the same reason why, or one of the reasons I suspect why they won't advocate for payment of a continuous glucose monitor for patients at high risk. In other words, follow the money. So again, why won't my doctor at the HMO routinely do a baseline insulin or a glucose challenge, or pay for a CGM monitor if my A1C is high but less than 6.5? And their excuse is it's not in the ADA guidelines, which is true. Therefore, they have legal cover. That's what they want. Okay, they save money and they get legal cover. So they say, it's not in the guidelines. I'm a big HMO. We make billions of dollars every year, and we save money because the ADA, because of its corporate tie-ins, are saving money, right? They want you sick. I don't know how many guests you've had who are medical professions, like Casey Means or any of the others, who say they want you sick. That's it. And I'm not a conspiracist. I never was up till about my 72nd year. That's when I became, I put the dots together. It was just too much. Okay. Now, the next question to ask is, why won't my state or local government step in and compel the ADA and compel the providers to order these basic life-saving screening tests? Why? Well, the answer is follow the money. Lobbying by the big pharma and big food, right? So the doctors have an excuse. It's not in the guidelines. It's like the Nazis in World War II when they finally get to concentration camp capos. And they say, why did you do what you did? And they say, well, we were taking orders from above. But I can assure you more millions of people have been killed by patient neglect than in all the wars of First and Second World War. So I have undertaken to write government officials. I think I left it in some of the notes that I gave you. I've written to Bernie Sanders, AOC, Governor Newsom, and others, Katie Porter, saying, for heaven's sakes, let me outline the scientific basis for this. Whatever else you do, can we at least get these at-risk patients, who number in the millions, to have a baseline insulin test? That's all I'm asking for to begin with. And of course, I've had crickets. I know they're busy and they're overwhelmed, and this is not a priority for them. Now, you know that Nina Teicholz and others, Gary Toves and others, have tried to change the food guidelines. Every few years they go to try to change the guidelines, which are supposed to be changed every 5 years. And so far, up to 2025, it's still the old food pyramid guidelines and no screening. And I hope that's going to change. All right, let's turn to how prevalent is obesity and overweight in America. We know that 70% of the American population is either obese or overweight, and 43% are actually obese. And 93% have at least one criterion for metabolic syndrome. What are the criteria? To have metabolic syndrome, you have to have 3 or more of the following: obesity, hypertension, elevated fasting sugar, high triglycerides, and low HDL. And I had all of them. And so if you look at the HMO that I came out of, where I practiced for 25 of the last 40 years that I practiced before I left. And they're wonderful people. They're wonderful people. I got to tell you, they're very, very dedicated. They have time constraints. They have the primary care has about 7 minutes to see a patient, and cardiology about 20 minutes. They cannot in any way do a proper chart review during that time. But 80% of the 12 million people who belong to this big California HMO, 80% will be, 70% will be either obese or overweight. And of the 70%, 80% will have metabolic syndrome. So we're talking about 6 million patients, 6 million patients out of the 12. All right, what about the rest? What about people who are normal weight? Well, we know that 40% of people who have normal weight have metabolic syndrome. They are so-called thin on the outside, fat on the inside, or TOFI. Right? They won't know unless for some reason they had a scan of their liver, which showed that they have fat there. And or, of course, they have these other biochemical abnormalities. But most primary care physicians, most providers are just totally ignorant. They say, what's your problem? Your weight is normal. You're doing very well. Your A1C is only 5.7. You don't have diabetes. I'll see you in a year. Idiots. That's why I say it's criminal. And believe me, I was one of the idiots, so I know. I had no training, no formal training. Okay, what about the corrupt origins of the food guidelines and medical conflicts of interest? This is a big one. Let's first talk about the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, okay? This academy teaches all the registered dietitians in the country and licenses them. It writes the exams. Now, the academy was created and sponsored by the Seventh-day Adventists, an anti-meat religious doctrinaire group, and their paid lobbyists. So, as you may know, Ellen White was a founding prophetess in 1890, and she had visions in which she believed that eating meat made for lascivious thoughts, premature sex, masturbation, these were a no-no. And Lena Cooper, who was an acolyte of Ellen White, wrote the original textbooks, which are still followed by the American Academy. They're in their 44th printing, 44 editions, and it's still used. And many people, current graduates of the dietetic schools, have this as one of their basic textbooks. And Harvey Kellogg, as you know, of Kellogg cereal, was a follower of Ellen White. He was tasked with typesetting her notes. He read all her books, and he was a Seventh-day Adventist. And he and his brother, when they grew up, created Kellogg cornflakes, which was as a meat substitute. And he built a sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, as you know, and it attracted a lot of world leaders and so on. But they didn't understand that there was a hidden agenda of anti-meat propaganda, shall we say. Now, a lot of corporations will pay online YouTube influencer dietitians to promulgate the vegan and vegetarian lifestyle and to say that things like ice cream and cornflakes and so on are okay. So to add insult to injury, these companies rake in billions of dollars annually, of course. They are tax exempt, like in Australia, the sanitarium, which is run by the Seventh-day Adventists, tax exempt. They have created a monocrop monopoly. Kellogg's is fully integrated vertically. They own their own farms to harvest the corn and other grains. They process them in their own plants. They ship them in their own ships. And they're also heavily invested now in anti-diabetic drugs. Now, why would Kellogg's be invested in anti-diabetic drugs? I use Kellogg's, but I mean broadly speaking. And the answer, of course, is because they know that they're going to make people sick, and they want hand in both pies, right? So Nick Mottern was a Seventh-day Adventist who worked with the McGovern Commission in 1977. And this Seventh-day Adventist was given the responsibility of writing the modern pyramid food guidelines, which came out in 1980, over the objections of mature scientists who felt that they were rushing to judgment, that there wasn't enough evidence, and in fact, there was more evidence that perhaps sugar was a culprit and not saturated fat, as John Yudkin years earlier had promulgated. And this, of course, led to the epidemics that we're now seeing of obesity, diabetes, cancer, atherosclerotic heart disease, macular degeneration, et cetera, et cetera. So all these modern diseases were unknown virtually 150 years ago, before industrial food processing began. They were unknown, very, very rare. And it's not because they didn't know about it. Okay, so food pyramid, my plate, food compass are all corrupt in my view. The Dietitian Academy gets 90% of its funding from Big Food and Big Pharmacy, and it has stock portfolios in these companies. The left hand massages the right hand. Okay. I'm sure this will all eventually come out in the wash once we have a sufficient body of ketogenic people who have street smarts and who know what's going on. And we need a certain critical mass before they come with their torches and their pitchforks to the tower of medicine to take their comeuppance. Anyway, so we know that high carb and toxic seed oils destroy mitochondrial metabolic metabolism, and even to this day, red meat and fat are demonized. Okay, what about the corrupt underpinnings of medical teaching, research, and practice? So we dealt with the Academy of Nutrition. Let's talk about the medical. So as you know, in 1911, Rockefeller and Carnegie sponsored the Flexner Report. Flexner was a lawyer, and that meant the death of holistic or functional medicine in favor of subdividing the body into organs. And as each organ became diseased, you developed drugs to treat each organ. Now, before 1905, you had giants like Sir William Osler, who were holistic. They were holistic. They treated the whole person. They spent time with the person, and they made the connections between disease and what they were doing, what they were eating, and what their lifestyle was, and so on. And there was perhaps even a spiritual dimension to it. But this is all gone now. It's reductionistic, and everything is siloed. The cardiologist doesn't speak to the GI person very rarely, you know. And of course, in all this siloing, the root cause, which is malnutrition, has been overlooked. Big pharma and big food, as we all know, are heavily invested in medical research. It was Reagan, I think, in '80 who cut off the majority of government funding for sponsored medical research, left it to the big pharma to step in and big food to step in and provide so much of the money for research. So if I'm paying the piper, you damn well better expect that I expect results favorable to what I'm doing, right? They're involved in financial gifts to medical schools. A lot of medical schools couldn't get by without their support. And of course, they're intimately involved in governing and licensing bodies like the AHA and the ADA and USDA, which to my mind are all corrupt anyway from the flow of money. Now, bribery scandals. We know about Ansel Keys, who had the diet heart hypothesis that cholesterol and saturated fat clogged your arteries the way fat or grease clogs a pipe. And he did a lot to challenge John Yudkin, who said, no, it's not the fat, it's the sugar. But of course, he had a very abrasive personality, and he took over the as a guiding force for the AHA and so on. He doctored and suppressed evidence. As you know, he had this famous 7-country study, which had a smooth line showing that if the more saturated fat you ate in a country, the greater the risk of heart disease. Until a study subsequently came out that he didn't actually study 7 countries. He studied 22 countries, and the dots were all over the map. There was no correlation whatsoever. He is, although at one time he was worshipped enough to appear on the cover of Time magazine, he is now rightfully reviled for the death of millions of people who followed his advice through the mouthpiece of the AHA and other governing bodies. And speaking of the AHA, they were a small organization originally. I don't think there were more than 500 cardiologists in the whole country. And they got from Procter & Gamble, the Crisco manufacturers, $1.6 million, which is equivalent to $30 million today. And I think right now they have an annual budget of hundreds of millions of dollars. And the ADA and other organizations look to them to give them dietary advice, even though they're heavily sponsored by these corporations. Around in Ansel Keys' time, there were 2 research scientists whose names escape me now. I think one of them was Fred Stare, S-T-A-R-E, but they were given a stipend of $5,600.
These are the Harvard guys?
The 2 Harvard guys, yeah. $5,600, equivalent to $50,000 now, to write in the New England Journal that it was fat, not sugar, that caused heart disease, which they knew to be false. And Ansel Keys even had a graph of smoking-related deaths, which was suppressed. He suppressed for years his knowledge that smoking was a major contributor. Okay. If we have time, I'd like to briefly touch on the wonderful work that was done on the anthropological evidence for carnivory, and citing giants like Michael Eads and Anthony Chaffee, Steve Finney. So yes, Homo sapiens has been eating meat primarily now for 300,000 years, but if we go back 3 million years, our ancestors of Homo sapiens also ate mostly animal protein. Of course, in the last 12,000 years, we've killed off the megafauna and we've turned to agriculture and animal husbandry. And we did this in order mainly to avoid mass starvation. So the Egyptians were the first bread eaters. They were known as the bread eaters. And if you look at their hieroglyphics, you'll see that the Egyptians are depicted as being very thin, stick-like figures, right? Well, what's the reality? If you take a look at their mummies, you see that the men have big bellies and man boobs from the estrogenic effects of eating bread all the time. Right? And they had all the dental diseases, some of which I've had: caries, bleeding gums. I've had tooth replacements. I have all my 4 molars are impacted, and I have 1 cyst. But it's quiescent, so I haven't taken it out. I'm going back in September to repeat my CT scan of my jaw to see whether or not Carnivore has healed over the cyst at all. But they had all these. The Roman aristocrats, of course, ate meat, but the plebeians, slaves, and gladiators got bread and circuses, right? That's what they got. But the gladiators didn't mind because they knew eating bread made them fat. And if you stuck an arrow in a gladiator, you had this big cushion of fat to prevent you from knifing your intestines. So it wasn't a big deal for them, but it just shows you. And in medieval times, the nobility ate meat, but the poachers got hanged, right? They knew where their best interests lay. In overseas, the Mongols were tall, they were muscular, and they were long-lived. And they had a portable delicatessen. They rode their horses, and they ate their horses, and they drank horse blood. And they conquered the largest empire the world has known. And the average height was about 6'4", according to Dr. Chafee. The American Indians, the buffalo eaters, their average height was 6'2", and it was not uncommon to see many of them 6'7". Jefferson met some of these American Indians. They reported some of their grandparents is living to 120, even 137, which was not considered abnormal. And then again, they were tall, muscular, lean, not an ounce of fat on them, you know. And they ate a ketogenic diet, basically. What about modern societies? Well, we have the Maasai, of course, and the Inuit. And the Maasai have genetic cousins, the Kikuyu, who eat mostly plant-based diets. And as Dr. Chafee pointed out, the Maasai are tall, lean, and muscular, have very little infectious diseases, probably because their LDL is high, and have longevity. But their neighbors, the Kikuyu, are shorter, fatter, sicker, same dental diseases. So that tells us something, right? Okay. So now let's turn to what are some of the illnesses that develop or progress because medical providers don't screen for them or give proper dietary advice. They don't look for high insulin levels or insulin resistance. And as I say, my HMO, with its 12 million members and with 8 million people at risk, are guilty of these deficiencies. So this is my proposal for a class action lawsuit. This is why I want to take it to the next level. Now, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Gary Fetke, who you may know, in Tasmania, has been arguing for the need for a class action lawsuit to awaken, to shock the medical establishment that the old ways of doing things will not fly anymore. So the premise is that these conditions would not have developed or progressed if a low-carb ketogenic diet had been recommended early on by the providers who are responsible for educating their patients. So what are some of these conditions? Well, here, let me take the most extreme examples. Obesity resulting in any type of gastric surgery with or without complications. Now, if a patient who's obese has been offered a ketogenic diet and has failed on the ketogenic diet for whatever reason, they don't like it, they can't get over the keto flu, any reason, but they gave it the good old college try, you know? But they failed. Okay, you can say, I've done what I needed to do. I showed them the benefits of ketogenic diet. They didn't take it. Okay, the next best thing is a bariatric surgery of some sort. They need to understand the complications, but at least they know. And Dr. Rob Sivas, who you may know, who is a bariatric surgeon in Florida, tries to educate his patients away from carb addiction so that they don't need to have a bariatric surgery. But I suspect what happens within my HMO is that these patients are first referred to a HMO dietitian who will preach either the standard diet or a variant vegan, vegetarian, DASH diet, but basically a variant of the standard American diet. And is it any wonder that they won't lose weight on these diets and end up in bariatric surgery? It's logical. Okay, what about the overweight or obese who come in and get a abdominal CT scan or an MRI scan for reasons having nothing to do with their weight necessarily? Maybe they have a kidney stone, maybe they have a gallstone, or the appendicitis. Okay, so the report comes back to the radiologist. Now, if the person reading the film was someone of the caliber of Sean O'Mara, who orders MRIs on his obese patients. Now, why does he order them? Because the MRI will show liver fat, abdominal fat, as a first marker for metabolic syndrome. Even if the primary provider, hasn't ordered any workup, this is an early warning red bell that something is wrong. Also, you can see, if you do a CT of the chest, you can see fat around the heart. If you do a CT or MRI of the abdomen, you can see fat in the liver and also visceral fat. And you can also see, if you're looking for it, muscle fat in the muscles. The muscles become degenerated. And a lot of older people who have metabolic syndrome can barely stand up because they have so much fat in their muscles that their muscles get weak, right? So Dr. O'Mara is enraged. He says, why does the medical establishment demand that their radiologists, when they report out whatever they're going to report out, also add, your patient has visceral fat or cardiac fat or muscle fat, and a workup for metabolic syndrome is recommended on this basis. They have metabolic syndrome until proven otherwise. Okay, but they don't report that out. Why not? Probably because it's not in their protocol. And if their patients did have metabolic syndrome, what's the first thing the patient's going to ask? What causes it? The answer is elevated insulin. How do I get my insulin down? Can you give me a pill, doc? No, it has to be my diet. What type of diet? Ketogenic diet. So we're going around in a vicious circle, right? So it's not reported out. So type 2 diabetes, as you know, should be, patients with this should have an opportunity to redress their grievances. There should be financial compensation for all these patients that I'm mentioning who've suffered as a result of medical ignorance, whether innocent ignorance or willful ignorance. They have suffered as a result. So the diabetic patient who gets long-term complications like amputations, neuropathy, kidney failure, visual impairments, and so on, these patients, in my view, should be compensated. There should be a fund, just like you have for toxic dumps. The HMO should be compelled to set up a fund to compensate these patients in a class action lawsuit for anything that they had. We're talking about 8 million patients here, you can imagine. But on the other hand, the HMO makes billions of dollars, and it's not supposed to be for profit, but don't kid yourself, it is. And I understand the chief executive officer makes a salary of $30 million plus bonus a year, which I would not begrudge them if they were doing their job, but they're not. Okay. So you can see why I'm so impassioned about this. We have a duty to make restitution to these patients, in my mind. Now, hypertension can result, of course, in kidney disease, kidney failure, especially for those ending up on dialysis. Right? And stroke patients, of course, heart attack patients, or any other heart condition such as congestive heart failure. All heart disease is diabetic heart disease. Basically, fundamentally, it starts out that way. And you can see the rise in insulin before, if people would look for it. And you get a big mass of fat very often around the heart, and some of this will end up in the arteries. or will compromise heart function so that a person goes into congestive heart failure. Yeah. Patients who have undergone elective surgical procedures like coronary stents and bypass. Now, why not? Why just elective and not emergency? Because if it's an emergency, if I had chest pain and I went to the emergency room and they diagnosed that I had a heart attack, I would want to have a catheterization. I would want to have either a stent or a bypass. Okay, that's an acute emergency situation. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about someone who has maybe an abnormal treadmill test, a stress test, and they may or may not have symptoms. But the surgery, if it's done, can be done on an elective basis usually. But these people are never given a ketogenic diet to see whether or not their coronary artery plaque will reverse themselves. And there have been reports in the case literature. And individuals have also, with a stroke, they've seen a blockage. It's a little bit easier with a stroke because you can get circulation coming in from the other side to compensate. Okay. But when they went on the ketogenic diet, there have been reports of individuals who, with a follow-up scan, show that the plaque has resolved. Okay. All right. So elective surgical heart procedures probably can be postponed, at least to give this patient a chance to heal his lesions on the basis of a ketogenic diet. Okay. Macular degeneration. 1 in 3 adults will get it in America. And it's due in large part to the consumption of seed oils, which cause oxidative damage. And then you get glycation, and you get these globs of gunk on the back of the eyes, on the retina, which interferes with vision. So Chris Kenobi, who you may know, a leading ophthalmologist, has been ranting against the use of seed oils for this reason. He's an ophthalmologist. He's the guy who's tasked with trying to cure wet and dry macular degeneration. You know, sometimes they give injections into the eyeballs. Just horrible stuff. Not needed if we got rid of seed oils and, of course, sugar. Okay. Now, a lot of these patients go on a ketogenic diet. Their cholesterol goes up. Doctors fly into a panic. Your cholesterol is high. Here, take a statin or PCSK9 inhibitor. That's what happened to me. And I believe is responsible for lowering my HDL and giving me osteoporosis. So it's personal with me. And we'll talk more about that, but if we have time a little bit later. Patients who may have an intractable seizure disorder in the old days, the cure was giving them a ketogenic diet. You deprive the brain of excess glucose, insulin came down, and their brain function recovered. But my bet is that few of the epileptics know about a ketogenic diet, except for patients who are wise enough to go to the Charlie Foundation, because this man's son, Charlie, was only able to cure his intractable epilepsy by going on a ketogenic diet. And he has names of practitioners that will give their patients ketogenic diets. Charlie Foundation. All right. There are a lot of patients who have extremity swelling. They have lymphedema or they have lipedema. And these conditions can be ameliorated or cured by going on a ketogenic diet. Now, Leslyn Keith wrote a book called The Lymphatic Code, in which she showed that she got her PhD thesis on showing that you could reverse lymphedema and lipedema. Even if they're severe, you can ameliorate them or reverse it. So that's another way in which you can treat it. And of course, sleep apnea. What do we do now? Well, a patient has excess ectopic fat in his tongue and in his throat, which causes swelling, which chokes off the airway when they're recumbent at night when they sleep. The tongue falls back and chokes off the airway. Okay. Their oxygen levels fall to dangerous levels, or can fall, and can be a cause of sudden death from a rhythm disturbance in the heart. Okay, so what do? We give them these CPAP machines. But we never tell them you don't need this expensive mechanical device. What you need is a ketogenic diet to lose the weight, to get the fat out of the tongue and the neck. And so that's what happened with me. And I don't have right now passport pictures, but you could see 10 years ago with my fat neck, nose, and neck, face, and versus now. Okay. Now, we haven't touched on mental illness, but we know from the work of George Eade and Chris Palmer that they're reversing the incidence of psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, putting patients on a ketogenic diet. Their brains function better, but not being totally bombarded all the time with sugar and insulin. And so this is metabolic psychiatry is now taking off, and we're going to see more studies in support of that. Autism is another one. Okay. Now, I haven't included cancer, but Thomas Seyfried, as you may know, is a cancer specialist who has advised on the ketogenic diet because cancer cells are avid for sugar. They have 6 times as many glucose receptors or insulin receptors, I don't know which, and 400 times more avidity for sugar than a regular cell. So if you deprive them of sugar, they cannot live on ketones. So if you put them in a ketogenic state, you can see regression of a lot of these tumors. And most people don't know about that. Not every tumor, but it's worth a try. He has a specific treatment protocol in which he addresses this, which we don't have time to go into. So my other beef against my HMO is that, as Dr. Fetke showed with his own hospitals, is that they serve inflammatory crap. There's no other way of putting it. They defer to their dietitians. And so a typical breakfast may be buckwheat or jam, jelly, whole wheat bread, toast. Lunch and dinner, same. They have gravies, they have sauces, they have salad dressings made with seed oils, right? When I went into my HMO to take pictures, because I wanted to see what was going on there, their vending machines, they're all full of processed food for the cafeteria workers, for the staff, for the patients coming in. You don't think that the HMO is getting kickbacks from these companies to sponsor these vending machines there? You have another thing coming. You don't think that the HMO gets reduced prices or kickbacks from Big Food for putting this pig swill and giving it to patients who may have recently had surgery, and they're giving them inflammatory foodstuffs in quotation.
Criminal.
Okay. Criminal. It is criminal. Dr. Fetke's been trying to deal with this problem for years, but he's a gentleman. He's doing it the nice way. I'm more of a bull in a china shop type of person. These people need to be confronted. They need to have their eyes open. Now, I know that sites like yours will eventually inform more patients, but we need to confront directly the people who are doing this. Okay. So, and then finally, the overprescribing of potentially toxic medications like statins, PCSK9 inhibitors. Now, here's a book on the toxicity of seed oils, but she also talks about, this is Dark Calories by Dr. Kate Shanahan, who you may know, and if you don't know her yet, you probably should interview her. But the title is How Vegetable Oils Destroy Our Health and How We Can Get It Back. And she is a biochemist by training, and then became a family practitioner. And she has railed in the last 20 years against the use of seed oils because, they're processed in factories. The seeds, it has nothing to do with vegetables. And so it comes out as a thick gunk, which has to be winterized and deodorized and so on. But there are still hundreds of toxins in there that the research chemists cannot get out. Hexane is supposed to be a volatile to come off during the process, but you can still get hexane dissolved in the fluid, and that's a neurotoxin. 4-HNE is another. So they damage the delicate membranes of mitochondria of the cells, cell walls, and so on. And they poison the mitochondria. The mitochondria become full of ceramides, which we would think of as earwax. Basically, they can't function. So the energy level is depressed in the mitochondria, and the brain is signaled you've got to eat something. And what you usually eat is not necessarily more seed oils, but you usually eat more carbohydrates. That's where, and both carbohydrates and seed oils are addictive. The seed oils stimulate the release of cannabinoids from the gut. Cannabinoids that go to the brain, right, and stimulate hunger. And of course, the especially the fructose from sucrose that we get from eating plant material goes directly to the brain's reward center and stimulates dopamine release and so on. And the emeritus professor, Dr. Robert Lustig, has been railing against the use of fructose-containing foods, high fructose corn syrup, for years. And his book, Metabolical, especially for physicians who are ignorant of this, the science behind why fructose is so damaging. Paul Mason is another stellar person, Peter Bruckner. They also have been arguing against it, and also the lectins contained in nightshades. And you can see when the lectins are absorbed, like gliadin and in bread and so on, they travel right up from the gut through the vagus nerve into the brain. You can actually see them ascending, and they cause all sorts of havoc in the brain. Of course, sugar has been associated. Well, we'll talk. Let me get to the overprescribing of some of these toxic medications, and so a lot of people, when they're doctors often think of themselves as being godlike, prescribe these medications like statins and PCSK9 inhibitors. For high cholesterol, the patients are tongue-tied. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to argue. But I've heard this or I've heard that. Well, in the notes that I will be sending you, I don't have them quite ready yet, which you can use as show notes. I've outlined a case, study by study, in terms that a physician can understand, certainly a patient can understand it, why these medications, in many cases, especially those on a ketogenic diet, should not be prescribed these medications. And I'll mention just a few articles here. First of all, osteoporosis. You know that I have it. My T-score, the upper limit of normal, is -2.5, -2.6. So I don't have it majorly in my left femoral neck, but I don't want to risk a fall and a fracture either. And had I continued with the statins, it's likely that the osteoporosis would have progressed. On the atorvastatin, 40 milligrams, usually more than 20 is associated with an increased risk. But we don't have adequate randomized clinical trials yet to make a definitive diagnosis. We only have the suggestion. But a stronger one is since I had pre-diabetes in the past, and my A1C was 5.8, but it's now 5.4. Had I continued on the statin, I'd had increased risk of type 2 diabetes and its dreaded long-term complications. Now, how do we know this? Because the Women's Health Initiative was done in 2006 at a cost of $700 million, some crazy amount. And it showed that not only did women with prior MI have a 26% increased risk of getting a second MI, but elderly women increased their risk of type 2 diabetes by 71%. Now, why is that? It's because in the cholesterol pathway, there are two critical enzymes. One is called dolichol, which is involved in insulin receptor site activation, and the other is called selenoprotein, and it's involved in the migration of glucose transport receptors to the surface of the mitochondria so that they can take in glucose. And so if you suppress these because you're giving something to prevent the production of cholesterol and all these other derived pathways, you're going to interfere with the ability to detect insulin and to absorb insulin and sugar. So as a result of stopping my statins in September of 22, when I started the ketogenic diet, my A1C went down to 5.4, from 5.8 to 5.4 over the course of about 18 months. So my risk of, so long as I stay off of statins and I keep to the ketogenic diet, my risk of getting diabetes, my risk of increasing the A1C over time to 6.5 threshold is significantly diminished. And so my current lifestyle choices are in favor of optimizing my A1C. Now, my HMO gives us normal range between 4.8 and 5.6, but Dr. Sivas and others say no, it's actually between 4.5 and 5.2. That's optimal. So that's what I'm shooting for, even though from the point of view of my HMO, my sugars are normal. Okay. So others have written that Dr. Diamond, Dr. Bickman, Dr. Mason, in an open access article, a current opinion, show that statins therapy is not warranted for a person with high LDL on a low carb ketogenic diet. And these notes, if you include them in the show notes, will show will outline why this is. And then, of course, your audience can go to the actual original articles to see for themselves. Anyway, most of the studies showed that there's either no benefit from the statins in terms of reducing heart disease or all-cause mortality, or even an inverse, that if you lower the LDL, the risk of heart disease and cancer and diabetes and all-cause mortality goes up. So this is quoted in the notes that I gave. And so a person may say, well, the doctor may say, well, you need to take this. It's going to improve your longevity. But the study was done to see how much longevity actually increased when patients were put on statins. Now, a patient not knowing this would say, well, maybe I'll get extra years in my life if I take a statin. But no, because the British Medical Journal in an open access article in 2015 said that statins increase secondary survival after a heart attack by only 4.1 days. Days, Dave. And if you've had no prior MI, it increases your longevity by 3.2 days after daily use for up to 6 years. So you weigh that against the tremendous potential for side effects. What's the benefit? So, as I say, the statins decreased my HDL, which was my quote unquote good cholesterol, as well as reducing my LDL. My doctor had no comment because he didn't know. And what the mind does not know, the eyes do not see. And more recently, in 2017, there was a Pure study showing that the higher the carb intake, the higher the mortality, and the higher the fat intake, the lower the mortality, regardless of the type of fat. And that saturated fat intake was inversely associated with stroke, but you don't hear a word about it.
So, yeah, that'd be inconvenient for a lot of people if that information was too widely spread, right?
Yeah, they follow the money. It's there. It's all in writing. So, as I say, by reducing my carb intake to essentially 20 grams of or less, which means that any carbs I'm getting is basically I'm getting from the meat that I'm eating, because some of that will store glycogen, which, as you know, is a storage hormone, a storage form of glucose. So I lost 62 pounds of fat over 20 months. And as far as substituting polyunsaturated fatty acids, the seed oils, which the cardiologist I went to recommended, try to substitute that for the saturated fat you're taking, and you'll be fine. But the Sydney Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Artery Study both showed that when you made the substitution, you increase your risk of heart disease, and you increase overall death rate, and it actually increases your risk of cancer and so on.
So, what is your proposal going forward, and how can people kind of get in contact?
Okay, well, I'm generally a pretty private person. this is a new rule for me. There is honor in it, but there's no glory in it. I would like for members of any members of your audience who are either attorneys, work for attorney groups, or work for public interest groups, who would be willing to contact you as a screening, and then I can review it and maybe contact them. But other than that, I wish to remain fairly private, except when it comes to taking action, doing a class action lawsuit, in which I might be a lead plaintiff in that. Right now, I have to tell you that I have tried getting a hold of public interest groups. I've written them with all the science behind it. I've tried major malpractice groups or personal injury groups to try to get them interested in this, but it's a daunting task for them. I understand. It's a $4.3 trillion growth industry, medicine is. And they have batteries of lawyers. There's going to be an overwhelming number of patients who, once they learn the truth, will probably want to get on board this class action. They're going to need staff to screen these patients according to some of the criteria that I mentioned. And it's going to be a long slug, and there's no guarantee of winning, but at least it will be brought to public attention. So if there are attorneys or attorney groups who would be willing to take this on, it's a major undertaking, and I don't think it's been done before, then I would be willing to receive emails from them. But otherwise, I'm going to demur, and I think you understand why that is. I expect the members of my HMO physician providers and others who see me, some will understand what I'm trying to do, and otherwise I may be met with opprobrium. So it's an uncomfortable feeling for me. But my first goal now is to protect the patients, your listening audience, right? So that's all I have to say, pretty much. And I will have some additional notes for you to provide your audience with, so that they can, when the cardiologist or primary provider reflexively gives them these medications, because that's all we know in allopathic medication. We don't know root cause. We just know disease and give them medication. Then they have a way of scientifically, with a rationale, coolly giving them this medication. Maybe they can educate their doctors to dispel their ignorance. All right. That's it for me.
Well, Don, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this information with us. I really appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing.